Hello and welcome to the JW Review. My name is Mike Felker and we are looking at study article number 22 from the May 2025 Watchtower Study Edition. And if you've been following along, there are two more study articles in this issue. So this one has a lot of topics, so let's dive right in. The key text is John 17:26, which says, "And I have made your name known to them, and I will make it known, so that the love with which you loved me may be in them, and I in them." So one thing I do want to point out regarding the name, which of course a lot of this is going to be about, is that in the New World Translation, Jesus never uses the name Jehovah one time in this entire prayer, or in any prayer from Jesus. He never in prayer uses the divine name in the New World Translation. Also in John 17, which I think is the longest prayer from Jesus, but he doesn't use the divine name one time in the New World Translation. That is really, really interesting. So let's go to paragraph 3. Let's skip through some of this. So paragraph 3. In this prayer, Jesus said, "I've made your name known to them." In fact, he twice mentioned that he had made Jehovah's name known to his disciples. What did he mean? Get this. So if you're going to catch anything I say in this podcast or video, get this. What did Jesus mean by making the name known? So mark this down. Had he revealed to them a name that they did not know? So when Jesus says, "I'm making your name known to them," speaking to the Father, had he revealed to them a name they did not know? They continue on. Jesus' disciples were Jews, so they already knew God's name, Jehovah. That name appears thousands of times in the Hebrew Scriptures. So Jesus was not referring to the personal name of God. So circle this, underline this, clip it out, save this. And this is not the first time Watchtower has said this. I think it's been a while since they said this. But the reason I say to mark this down, remember it, copy it, whatever, is because I can't tell you how many times Jehovah's Witnesses have used this verse to show me somehow that by making the name known to them, that means using the name Jehovah to them. I've heard that just countless times, and the Jehovah's Witnesses would die in their grave, or they die on that hill for that particular point. So really, really interesting that they say this, and fascinating, and I think that's something that should be marked down, because I've heard this a million times. So really glad they're actually admitting it here. But one thing I want to point out is that in the next study article, it's almost like they have amnesia when they're referring to this point. It's almost like they forgot all of this. They forgot that, Jesus is not talking about the personal name of God here. It's almost like they forget that. In fact, I'll let you in on a little secret. I accidentally recorded that video or podcast already for the next study article because I forgot about this one and I did that one. And so when I was recording that one, I'd forgotten about this point, and it was almost if Watchtower didn't even remember they wrote this. So I was arguing this point. I was arguing the point in that review, which you will hopefully see within maybe a couple of days or a week possibly. But I was arguing this exact point that they're making here, that Jesus was not talking about making the name Jehovah known to people or using the word Jehovah. That's not what he meant. So you'll see it when you get there, when you check out that review, and I hope that you do. So Jesus was not referring to the personal name of God, thank you, Watchtower. Rather, he was referring to what that name represented. Jesus had made known the person behind Jehovah's name, including his purposes, activities, and qualities in a way that no one else ever could. But I think they're going too far here, because I don't think Jesus is talking about the personal name of God here. There's no indication that he's talking about the personal name of God. He's speaking to the Father. Jesus could have used the name Jehovah in prayer. Nothing was stopping him. He could have done that, but he didn't. He didn't. So we're not talking about Jehovah's personal name. So we're not even talking so much about what's the meaning behind the personal name. We're talking about who the Father is. So it's the Father, his purposes, activities, and qualities. Okay, so next point, paragraph number 4. So this is a really interesting illustration. To illustrate, imagine that there's an elder in your congregation named David, and he is also a surgeon. Interesting. So you have Jehovah's Witnesses surgeons now. Well, I guess now that there's higher education, then I think my camera got messed up here. So now that there is a higher education that's allowable, which hopefully I'll have time to record a podcast on that. Definitely worth going over. I guess we're going to have more surgeons now and more Jehovah's Witnesses entering in different kinds of careers. We'll just have to see. Okay, so David's also a surgeon. You have known that brother for many years, but then one day you have a medical emergency. You are rushed to the hospital where that brother works, and he uses his medical skill to save your life. Does that brother's name now take on more meaning for you? Of course it does. David is no longer just the elder, he is also the surgeon who saved your life. Okay, well, what's the problem here? Well, the problem in this illustration is that Jesus is not... He's not saying that, here is Jehovah, and here are all of these things that bring that name Jehovah more meaning. No, Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus doesn't say, hey, disciples, the Father's name is Jehovah, or he doesn't do that. It's not the personal name that's in view here. It's what's behind who the Father is. That's why Jesus is using the word Father or the title Father. It's a title of intimacy. Paragraph 5. In a similar way, Jesus' disciples already knew Jehovah's name. Yes, thank you, Watchtower. But that name took on greater meaning for them as a result of Jesus' ministry. Why can we say that? Because Jesus reflected the personality of his Father in everything he said and did. Okay, so what I'm going to argue for is that it was much more than that. It's not just that Jesus reflected the personality of the Father. He has all the attributes, the same attributes that the Father has, because he is of the same nature as the Father. And we'll look at a couple of scriptures here. So Hebrews 1:3. Jesus, who is the radiance of his glory. So Jesus is the radiance of the Father's glory and the exact representation of not the personality of the Father, but the nature of the Father. So the character of his hypostasis. Exact representation of his nature. What is someone's nature? That which makes something what it is. God has a unique nature, one of a kind. There is nothing like it. All right? But Jesus is a reflection of that. He's the radiance of his glory and the exact representation of that nature. And within someone's nature are those attributes, those things that make something uniquely what it is. Another one is John 1:18. It says, no one has seen God at any time. That's referring to the Father. And we'll talk about this more here in a little bit. The only begotten God, the monogenes theos, that's the Greek, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him or exegeted him. So Jesus is the only begotten God. And of course, elsewhere, we have the only begotten Son. We have that Son being the same nature of the Father. So they have to share the same attributes, or else they would be of different natures. But Jesus is the only begotten God because he's begotten from the Father from eternity past. Another one, John 14. Jesus said, well, let me back up to verse 18. Philip said to him, Lord, show us the Father, and it is enough for us. Verse 9, Jesus said to him, have I been with you all so long, and you have not come to know me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? So Jesus so perfectly represents the Father, not just the personality, but he has all the attributes. Everything that the Father has is in the Son. That's how we can represent him perfectly. There's no reason to see the Father because there's no attribute the Father has that Jesus doesn't have. Next, they say, so his apostles came to know Jehovah better by listening to the way Jesus taught and by observing the way he dealt with people. So Watchtower is slipping in their theology here. You come to know the Father better by coming to know Jesus, since Jesus perfectly represents the Father. Paragraph 6. In his prayer, Jesus prayed for his disciples, saying, watch over them on account of your own name, which you have given me. Does this mean that Jesus would now be known as Jehovah? They say no. No. Notice that in his prayer, Jesus refers to the name Jehovah as your own name. So Jehovah's name did not become Jesus' personal name, but Scripture would say, in a way, it actually did. And if we go to Romans chapter 10, verses 9 through 13, specifically in verse 13, it says, whoever calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. The Greek word Lord there is kurios. That's the same Greek word in verse 9 that if you confess with your mouth Jesus as Lord, kurios, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. So whoever calls upon the name of the Lord, that is Jesus. Jesus is that Lord that you are to call on. Same Greek word. Now, of course, Romans 10:13 is a citation of Joel 2:32, which says, and it will be that everyone who calls on the name of Yahweh will be delivered. So what Paul is doing, he's taking that verse about Yahweh and applying it to Jesus. So in a way, yes, Jesus now bears that name. He bears that name. And we're about to see some more examples of that when we look at the Hebrew Scriptures, where we have the angels who represented Jehovah. So what then did Jesus mean when he said that God's name had been given to him? First of all, Jesus was Jehovah's representative and spokesman. Well, he was not only that, he was much, much more. He came in his Father's name and performed powerful works in that name. Additionally, the name Jesus means Jehovah is salvation. Yes, the divine name was closely associated with Jesus' name. But I would say this is not going far enough, because you would never be devoted to the agent of a sender in this way. So when a king sends his agent, you don't see this kind of exclusive devotion given to the agent like you would have of a king. Okay? You just don't have that. And what you see with Jesus goes far beyond what agency can really mean. So just some examples of Philippians 2:9 through 11. Therefore God highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name which is above every name. What is the name that's above every name? Well, if that's the name Jehovah, then that name was bestowed on him, so that at the name of Jesus, or the name belonging to Jesus, that's in the genitive, every knee will bow, of those who are in heaven and on the earth and under the earth, and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. And what is this? This is actually a citation from the Hebrew Scriptures about Yahweh, every knee bowing to Yahweh and every tongue confessing in Yahweh. But this is being applied to Jesus. This is like worship in the highest form. It's given to Jesus. You could never say this. You could never apply words like this to a mere agent. Jesus is so much more than that. They say next, so the ambassador's words have the same authority as that of the ruler. But an agent wouldn't say, if you've seen me, you've seen the ruler. So if someone came up to the agent and said, hey, you need to show us the king. And what if the agent says, oh, there's no reason for you to see the king. You have me. If you've seen me, you've seen the king. That would be a very, very deficient representation of the king, because he's not the king. He doesn't have the same attributes or authority of the king, except for what the king directed him to say. Big, big, big difference. But we're about to see more about agency and how the Watchtower just doesn't go far enough. Look at paragraph 8. In his role as the Word, Jesus has served as Jehovah's spokesman by conveying information and instructions to other spirit sons of God, as well as to humans. You saw here John 1:1-3. We all know what that says. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Jesus was likely the angel whom Jehovah sent to care for the Israelites during the time of the Exodus. When telling the Israelites to obey that angel, Jehovah said, because my name is in him. And they say here to read Exodus 23:20 and 21. It says, behold, I am going to send an angel before you to keep you along the way and to bring you into the place which I have prepared. Keep watch of yourself before him and listen to his voice. Do not be rebellious toward him, for he will not pardon your transgressions, since my name is in him. Okay, so let's look at a couple of verses here. Genesis 16:7. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. So Genesis 16:7-13. So in verse 7, and hopefully you can see this on the screen, and I have the key portions highlighted. So in Genesis 16:7 it says, the angel of Yahweh found her by a spring of water in the wilderness. And then in verse 9, you have the angel of Yahweh saying to her, return to your mistress and humble yourself in her hands. And then in verse 11, it says, behold, you are with child, and you will bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because Yahweh has heard your affliction. Look at this in verse 13. Then she called the name of Yahweh who spoke to her. You are a God who sees. For she said, have I even remained alive here after seeing him? Isn't that incredible? She's wondering how she is still alive after seeing Yahweh. But it says up here in verse 7, it's the angel or messenger of Yahweh. So she thinks she saw Yahweh. Let's skip down to Genesis 18. It says in verse 1, then Yahweh appeared to him. So you have an appearance of Yahweh. If you go down to verse 17, you have Yahweh speaking. And then in verse 20, you have Yahweh speaking. And then in verse 21, Yahweh says, I will go down now and see whether they have done entirely according to its outcry which has come to me. And if not, I will know. And look at this, verse 22. Abraham was still standing before Yahweh. Abraham was standing before Yahweh. Then it says in verse 25, shall not the judge of all the earth do justice? So just to back up here, you have Yahweh appearing to Abraham. Yahweh appearing, Yahweh speaking, and Abraham standing before Yahweh. And then in 1924, it says, and Yahweh rained on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from Yahweh out of heaven. What do you have here? You have two persons in different locations, both being identified as Yahweh. Judges 6:11. In verse 11, you have the angel of Yahweh coming and sitting down. Verse 12, you have Yahweh appearing and saying, Yahweh is with you. He's speaking to Gideon here. So Yahweh is with you. And Gideon said, if Yahweh is with us, so there's some correspondence here. And look at this, verse 14. Then Yahweh turned to him. Look at that. So in verse 11, you have the angel of Yahweh coming. Verse 14, Yahweh turned to Gideon and said something. And then Gideon says back, O Lord, with what shall I save Israel? Look at this in verse 16. Yahweh said to him, surely I will be with you. And in verse 20, it switches back. And the angel of God said to him. Then in verse 21, you have the angel of Yahweh. Again, verse 21, the angel of Yahweh went away. And look at verse 22. Gideon saw that he was the angel of Yahweh. So he said, alas, O Lord Yahweh, for now I have seen the angel or messenger of Yahweh face to face. And Yahweh said to him, peace be to you. Do not fear, you shall not die. You shall not die. So Gideon built an altar there to Yahweh. So it's almost like in this text, well, not almost, it really is in this text, that you have the angel of Yahweh and Yahweh being used interchangeably. So who is this angel of Yahweh? Well, it would be Jesus, and it would make perfect sense that it would be Jesus. So if Jesus represents the Father so perfectly, not only in his personality, but also in his essence, it would make sense that people could mistake this person from Yahweh. It would make sense to where they say, oh, well, this is the angel of Yahweh, but wait, it's actually Yahweh. So you can see how all of this works. You have two persons in view, and I think Genesis 19:24 encapsulates it perfectly. And if you want to see just more instances of this and how this works out in Jewish theology, there's a really interesting book called The Two Powers in Heaven by Alan Siegel. It's a pretty old book, but it's pretty easily obtainable. And you can actually see in that book how the Jews had this concept of these two powers in heaven. You could call it a binitarian type of theology. Really, really interesting. So just to tie all of this back in here. So Jehovah's name did not become Jesus' personal name, but Jesus, at least in these cases that we saw, Jesus functioned with that name. But he could still be distinct from Yahweh. So he can be called Yahweh, but also be distinct from Yahweh. And that whole idea really kind of is where Trinitarian theology kind of comes into full force when Jesus comes. Because they already had, if you read the book, Alan Siegel's book, this will kind of make a little bit more sense. So they already had this conception in their mind about these two powers in heaven, being Yahweh and also being distinct from Yahweh. And then when Jesus comes, and then Paul develops the theology, this all starts to really get worked out. Really, really fascinating. Paragraph 10. Jesus too glorified his Father's name. How so? One way was by revealing his Father's amazing qualities and actions to others. Yet more was involved in glorifying that name. Jehovah's name needed to be sanctified and his reputation vindicated. Jesus showed how important this was when he taught his followers the model prayer. He said, "Our Father in the heavens, let your name be sanctified." Now they're going to go over this whole idea of Jehovah's reputation being vindicated all throughout this article. But how do we know that in Matthew 6:9, when Jesus said, "Our Father in the heavens, let your name be sanctified," how do we know that Jesus is talking about having Jehovah's reputation vindicated? Where are they getting that from? Because that is not in this verse that they are citing. Then in paragraph 11, they talk about Adam and Eve and Satan and the temptation and whatnot. And they say here at the end of paragraph 11, time was needed in order to prove who was the liar, Jehovah or Satan. My question is, where does the Bible teach this? Where does the Bible teach this? Are they really saying that when we're reading Revelation, that you needed time to know who was the liar? Jehovah's the creator of the universe, okay? No time is needed to prove that. Prove that to who? Where is this coming from? It's not in the scriptures. So is Watchtower teaching that Jehovah might have been a liar all of that time until it was proved at some point later? Or we weren't sure about it? I don't know where they're getting that from. Paragraph 12. Because of his love for Jehovah, Jesus wanted to do all he could to sanctify and vindicate Jehovah's name. I surrender my life, Jesus said. Okay, so if we go to John 10, 17, and 18, we actually don't find this idea. In verse 17 it says, "For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life so that I may take it again." Notice that. Jesus is involved in his own resurrection. You also find that in John chapter 2, verses 19 through 21. "No one takes it away from me, but from myself I lay it down. I have authority to lay it down. I have authority to take it up again. This commandment I received from my Father." So, where do you see here the vindication of Jehovah's name? I don't see it in these verses, but the Watchtower is citing these verses to support that. They continue, "Yes, he was even willing to die for Jehovah's name." Where does it say that? Where does it say that? The first two perfect humans, Adam and Eve, turned their back on Jehovah and sided with Satan. In contrast, Jesus was willing to come to the earth and prove his love for Jehovah. Jesus did this by living a life of perfect integrity. Okay, so they cite here two passages. Do those passages support the point that Watchtower is saying here? So let's go to Hebrews 4:15 and see if it supports that point. "For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things like we are, yet without sin." Okay, I don't see what Watchtower's point is with citing this text. Let's go to the other one. Hebrews 5, 7 through 10. "He, in the days of his flesh, he offered up both prayers and supplications with loud crying and tears to the one able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. And having been made perfect, he became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation, being designated by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek." So let's read that sentence again and see once again if these passages support what they're saying. In contrast, Jesus was willing to come to the earth and prove his love for Jehovah. Jesus did this by living a life of perfect integrity. These scriptures don't say that was his purpose, to prove his love for Jehovah. He did love his Father, of course, but these verses don't say this. They don't teach this. "He maintained his integrity during his life right down to death on a torture stake. In this way, he proved his love for Jehovah and his name. I mean, maybe, but that's not what these verses are teaching. Paragraph 14. Jesus' trust in his Father was not misplaced. Jehovah did not allow him to remain in the grave. Let's read between the lines here. In Watchtower theology, Jehovah not allowing Jesus to remain in the grave means that Jehovah disposed of the body of Jesus and recreated Michael the archangel as an invisible spirit. That is reading between the lines here. That is their theology. They say here, he resurrected Jesus and gave him a superior position in heaven. Eventually, Jesus began ruling as king of God's kingdom. Eventually, no, Jesus said in Matthew 28, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Has been given to me. All authority in heaven and on earth. Jesus said that. So, by eventually, do they mean right upon being resurrected? No, they mean in 1914, almost 2,000 years later. That's what they mean by eventually, but Scripture does not teach that. All right, now we have some eschatology. See, we're jumping around all these different topics. Paragraph 15, in the near future, Jesus will wage war against God's enemies and destroy the wicked at Armageddon. Okay, so he destroys them at Armageddon, but then they're they're immediately resurrected, and they're going to be your next door neighbors during the 1,000 years. That is Watchtower theology. They're only destroyed for a moment, and then they're resurrected, and you get to teach them the What Does the Bible Really Teach book. Because they say here, in the near future. Near future. What does that mean? What does that mean? We all want to know, but Jehovah's Witnesses cannot tell us what that means. I say I think I actually said Bible Teach book on accident. That's actually the book that when I started talking to Jehovah's Witnesses, that was the book, and I spent a lot of time in that book, and I just for some reason had it in my mind. So what I meant to say was the You Can Live Forever in Paradise book. You all know what I mean. So will that be the book that you're going to be teaching everybody? Okay, during the 1,000 years. They say here, Jesus will restore peace and perfection to mankind during his 1,000-year reign. He will resurrect the dead. He will make the whole earth a paradise. Jehovah's purpose will be accomplished. So they say they restore peace and perfection during the 1,000 years, but that has to be at the end of the 1,000 years, because during the 1,000 years, at least at the start of it, you've got wicked and vile people who have been resurrected. And you have no idea if and when those people are going to become Jehovah's Witnesses. You don't know how long it's going to take for Jehovah to decide to wipe these people out if they're not repenting. So peace and perfection, not with wicked, vile people, millions, maybe billions of them living all around you. Paragraph 16, what can we expect to happen by the end of the 1,000-year reign? Human sin and imperfection will be gone. Mankind will no longer need to ask for forgiveness of their sins on the basis of the ransom. Neither will they need a mediator or a priesthood. Isn't it really interesting they mention that? Mankind will not need a mediator or a priesthood. Does Watchtower not know their own theology? Do they not know their own theology? Because they teach emphatically that Jesus is only the mediator for the 144,000, because it's for those in the new covenant, which is only for the 144,000. Why are they saying this? We can't ask these questions, right? Are you going to raise your hand in your Kingdom Hall meeting when you're going over this article, which I think has already been gone over by the time you're watching this? Can you raise your hand and say, excuse me, Watchtower here is saying that they won't need a mediator or a priesthood, but I thought that we can't have Jesus as our mediator because we're not in the new covenant. How does this work? Look what they say here. The graves will be empty. The dead will have been brought back to life. Again, reading between the lines. Jehovah's going to dispose of all these bodies, right? Because I found this out doing some really, really deep research. The Watchtower doesn't actually teach the resurrection of the corpse, the dead body. They don't actually teach that. What they teach is a completely new creation of a body. Essentially, you get copied, and then your memories and personalities get put into that newly created body. So what does God do with those bodies in the ground? What about those who died 5 minutes ago, and then Armageddon comes, and now it's time for the resurrection? What happens to that body? Well, if it's one of the anointed, Jehovah disposes of that body. Does he do the same thing for the other sheep or the great crowd? I don't know, because I couldn't find an answer for that in Watchtower theology, only that God is a completely new creation of the body, which goes against Scripture, by the way. Paragraph 17, what happens at the end of the 1,000-year reign? At that point, something very special will happen. The debate that involves the sanctification of Jehovah's name will end. How? In the Garden of Eden, Satan claimed that Jehovah is a liar and that he does not rule mankind out of love. Since that time, his name has been sanctified over and over again by those who honor and respect him. So at the end of the 1,000-year reign, Jehovah's reputation will be fully vindicated. He will have proved beyond all doubt that he is a loving heavenly Father. And then in 18, Satan's claims will finally be proved false once for all time. Well, I've got news for you all, Jehovah's Witnesses. I've got news for you all. Satan's claims were proved false beyond all reasonable doubt the moment he appeared on the scene. Okay? The moment he appeared on the scene. Because Satan is not the creator. God cannot lie, does not lie. It's impossible. Impossible. Okay? So, Jehovah's Witnesses, do you just not believe that it's been proven beyond all doubt? If that's what you believe, I'm sorry, but you have a problem. You have a problem. So, we're wrapping it up there. I hope this was helpful to you. We went through a lot of different topics. I probably went through them really fast. If you have any questions at all, please leave them down in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you if you have any questions at all. If you want to contact me personally, down in the description, there's several different ways to contact me privately, personally. I'll keep it all confidential. If you want to support this work, please hit the like button, notification bell, subscribe. All of that really, really helps with the algorithms. And please, if you're listening to this via podcast, please give it a 5-star review, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, wherever those are. Please consider giving me a 5-star review. That also really helps with the algorithm. Lastly, you can support this financially going down to the link in the description below. So like I said, next week's study article, I had already recorded this before I did this one, so maybe that will be really, really interesting. I didn't want to re-record it, so do with it what you will. So next, I'm really, really, really going to try to record a response to David Splain's New Light on Secular Education. Hopefully I have the time. I'm really excited to talk about that. I have a lot of thoughts, so maybe you can share your thoughts with me as well. So hope you have a great week. We'll see you next time. For more information about Jehovah's Witnesses and other topics, please visit michaeljfelker.com. There you can also reach me directly to submit questions or comments to be covered on the JW Review. To subscribe to this podcast, please go to iTunes and search for the JW Review.